today's episode of Killer Bites, we're talking about a case that actually remains unsolved to this very day. It's also a pretty divisive case. Although it happened almost 15 years ago, people are still arguing over who is responsible for the murder of a young mother and her unborn child. That's because the answer is either some mysterious unknown entity or an 11-year-old evil mastermind. This is the story of Jordan Brown. It was a typical Friday morning for Chris Brown and his family. Chris worked in the shipping department at a local tableware company, and he was running a little late to work that day. Still, he made sure to kiss his 26-year-old fiancée, Kenzie Houk, goodbye before leaving the house. Kenzie was 8 months pregnant, and that morning she'd actually asked Chris if he would stay home from work that day, but with another family member on the way, he said he had to go in. This would be a decision he would come to regret for the rest of his life. Kenzie had 2 daughters, a 7-year-old girl named Janessa and a 4-year-old named Adeline. Chris had 1 son, an 11-year-old named Jordan. The parents had actually known each other as teenagers in the small town of Wampum, Pennsylvania, with a population of only 600 people. However, it wasn't until later in life that they would pursue a relationship together. Already with children of their own, you might expect the merging of 2 families to be messy, but for Chris and Kenzie's kids, that wasn't the case. They all got along great. The daughters quickly warmed to having Chris as a father figure in their life, and Jordan did the same with Kenzie. He even called her mom. Chris and Kenzie were also expecting another child, a son, whom they'd already chosen to name Christopher after their father. The house was in a bit of disarray that morning since they were preparing for the new baby. Kenzie was staying in a bedroom downstairs, which was going to become Jordan's room after the baby was born, but until then, Jordan had a bedroom upstairs. He'd already moved his clothes into the downstairs bedroom, so that morning, when his sister woke him up to get ready for school, Jordan went downstairs to get his clothes and got ready in the bathroom. Jordan and Janessa were sitting on the couch in the living room when Kenzie came and told them they should start heading out to wait for the bus. Then she went to the downstairs bedroom to take a nap. Just as the kids left the house, around 8:15 a.m., the school bus arrived and off they went to school. At 9 a.m., tree trimmers came by the house to do some work. One of the workers spotted the 4-year-old on the front porch. She was in tears and said that her mom was dead. The worker called 911 immediately. One of the first responders on the scene was Pennsylvania State Police Corporal Jeffrey Martin. He knew Kenzie was pregnant. Like I said, it was a small town, so everybody knew everybody. So when he first found the expecting mother in the bedroom covered in blood, he assumed it was a medical emergency related to her pregnancy. Maybe it was a miscarriage, or maybe she'd hemorrhaged. Without touching anything or moving the body to prevent further damage, law enforcement called for medical backup to see if they could take any life-saving measures. A coroner arrived, and as they were handling the body, Officer Martin remembers them saying, "We have a problem." On the back of Kenzie's head was a bullet wound. That's when Officer Martin realized they weren't dealing with a medical emergency. They were dealing with a homicide. Wampum was a tiny rural town where not much happened, so word of the murder spread very quickly, and law enforcement didn't have a lot of experience dealing with a murder investigation. Nonetheless, the police knew they had a duty to find out who was responsible for such a horrendous crime. They started with informing the husband. When Chris heard that not only his fiancée, but his unborn child had been slain, he was devastated. Since he was one of the people closest to the victim, police had to be sure he wasn't a suspect. Chris was taken to the police station where he was questioned and his hands were swabbed for gun residue. However, he was able to give a firm alibi, being at work during the time the murder was speculated to have taken place, and his test results came back clean. He was cleared of any suspicion. The kids were pulled from school and informed of the unfortunate news. Since Jordan and Janessa were likely the last people to see Kenzie alive, they were also interviewed. Although they would be interviewed multiple times that day, in their initial interviews, both kids said they didn't remember anything out of the ordinary. Janessa explained that it was like any other morning before school, and Jordan basically said the same thing, except he had one tiny detail he did remember. He said that as he and his sister were leaving the house, he noticed a black truck parked right outside his house. He knew maintenance people were coming by later, so he figured maybe it was one of their cars. Obviously, the kids were sent home from school. The girls went to their grandparents, Kenzie's mom and dad, and Jordan stayed with his dad. The rest of the day was spent dealing with more interviews with the police, alerting friends and family, and just trying to come to terms with the tragic events. The police talked to Jordan 1 more time and Janessa 2 more times. That night, Chris and his son mourned the loss of a loving mother and partner. Chris recalled that they just sat and hugged each other and cried all night, and it wasn't until the early hours of the morning until they drifted off to sleep. Then, at around 3:30 a.m., Chris heard a pounding at the door. It was the police, and they had an arrest warrant for Jordan. Yeah, the police had a reason to believe that the 11-year-old stepson was responsible for first-degree murder. This came as a shock to everyone, Jordan especially. He had no idea what was going on. One minute he was sleeping, and the next he was being placed in a squad car and being taken to jail. He was only in 5th grade. When the police arrested him, the handcuffs had barely fit around his wrists. And because this was a homicide case, according to Pennsylvania law, regardless of Jordan's age, he was going to be tried as an adult. That meant that if Jordan were to be found guilty, he could be sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, making him the youngest person in history to be sentenced to life imprisonment. Jordan was placed in the Lawrence County Jail, a facility for adults. Things were moving very fast. A kid was being accused of double homicide since both Kenzie and her baby had passed away as a result of the gunshot wound, and he was being forced to share a 3-cell block with a bunch of full-grown criminals. When Chris went to visit Jordan in jail for the first time, he said he remembered seeing his son in an adult-sized prison jumpsuit, the smallest size they had. Jordan had to roll the sleeves and pant legs over and over just to be able to walk. It was obvious that this was not the place for him. There had to be some sort of mix-up. What evidence could the police possibly have that pointed to little Jordan as the culprit? After conducting investigations of the body and the crime scene, police had determined that the bullet had come from a shotgun. When they searched the rest of the farmland, they found multiple weapons. This included handguns, rifles, ammunition, and shotguns. Now, this wasn't super surprising since many families owned firearms in the area and participated in hunting. In fact, Chris and Jordan would often go hunting together. The 5th grader had his own 20-gauge shotgun, which was kept in the house. During the search of the house, an officer said the gun smelled like it had been recently fired. But what made police even more distrustful of Jordan was during one of Janessa's later interviews, she made a startling recollection. She remembered that Jordan had been messing with his guns that morning, and when she was waiting for Jordan to come downstairs so they could leave, she heard a big boom, which she said sounded like a gun. That seems like a pretty big detail to forget about in your initial interview. Jordan denied this, saying that he never touched his gun that morning, but the police were convinced enough to arrest him. Another reason they thought he was guilty was because in his second interview, Jordan also added to his story. He said he felt a piece of lint in his jacket pocket and he threw it on the ground as he and Janessa walked to the bus. Why he felt the need to mention that to police, I'm not sure, but as police were searching the property, they found a pristine shotgun shell around the area Jordan said he threw the lint. The officers suspected that the shell was from the blast that killed Kenzie and that Jordan only mentioned the lint story as a way to rid himself of guilt by telling a half-truth. I want to mention again that the family was into hunting, so finding shotgun shells on the ground was super common. Jordan and his dad probably practiced shooting on the property, and I'm sure the area was covered in them. But that didn't matter. As far as police were concerned, this was literally the smoking gun to solving the case. Even though Jordan's hands were never checked for gun residue, with Janessa's new story and Jordan's confession that he had thrown something on the ground, the police were convinced that Jordan was a hardened criminal. In his second interview, Jordan also added that he remembered seeing someone in the black truck he had originally mentioned. He said it was a man in a baseball cap. Could this be the real killer? And he wasn't the only one encouraging the police to look out for other potential suspects. Chris and several other family and friends had all actually mentioned one specific person, Adam Harvey. Adam was Kenzie's ex-boyfriend of 6 years. Not only did that mean he was someone else who had been close with the victim, but to make this worse, he had a history of violence. Apparently, Kenzie and her family had even filed a protective order against him. She had multiple reports of him threatening her. In one of the reports Kenzie filed, she stated, "Adam called my mother's phone and threatened to take my whole family out when he comes to town. He's left several messages threatening to hurt me and my family. I'm in fear of him hurting me physically or my family. He has a drinking problem that is uncontrollable. He's threatened to hire someone to hurt me several times. I've been talking to the police and they listened to the message on my mother's cell phone and suggested to me to get a PFA. PFA stands for Protection from Abuse and is similar to a restraining order. In another form, Kenzie described a time when Adam actually did turn to physical violence. She said, "We were arguing regarding my niece, and then Adam and I started to argue. I said, 'Shut up and act like an adult.' He then threatened me. I went to leave in my car and he took my keys. He left a big bruise on my forearm. His brother showed up and they threatened me and they both left when the police arrived." In any other case, Adam seemed to be the exact person that police would suspect of murdering Kenzie. But police claimed that they actually looked into Adam and he'd been cleared of suspicion. They tracked Adam down that very day and guess what? He was driving a black truck. It seems awfully coincidental that Jordan saw a suspicious-looking black truck that morning. How could he have even known about Adam or his car? But police say when they were investigating the vehicle that it still had snow on it. And because of that, police determined that there's no way Adam could have made the 24-mile drive to Kenzie's house back to his own and keep the snow on his hood intact. It seems like kind of a flimsy reasoning, but police also said during the interview with him that Adam had a firm alibi. He said he was sleeping at home at the time of the murder, and his father was able to confirm that. He was also subjected to a polygraph test and his hands were tested for gun residue. Both came back with results that indicated Adam was innocent. However, when police brought up the threats Adam had made against Kenzie and her family, he denied those claims. But weren't the PFAs he had against him indication enough? More recently, Kenzie and Adam had gotten into a dispute over child support. You see, when her youngest, Adeline, was born, Kenzie had told Adam that he was the biological father. But just a week before Kenzie's death, Adam got paternity test results back and learned that the child wasn't his, so he refused to support the child financially. It's likely he was furious that 1, he'd been lied to, and 2, this meant that his wife had been unfaithful. So it sounds to me like he had plenty of motives and a background in physical violence to take extreme actions against Kenzie, much more than Jordan did. After that, he even made threatening calls to Kenzie and her family. What's even more suspicious is that the night before the murder, Adam actually ran into Kenzie's family at a restaurant. And it seems like Adam wasn't over the paternity test results yet, because he ended up getting kicked out of the restaurant after getting in an argument with them and having to be restrained. Then, less than 12 hours later, Kenzie was found dead. Someone please explain to me how that's not a red flag. Police said that when Adam found out about the news of his ex-girlfriend, he broke down crying. An officer said he was pretty sure that the tears he shed were genuine. I'm not sure how he could be sure, but the police were convinced enough that Adam wasn't the culprit. Adam had told the police he didn't know where Kenzie lived. I find that hard to believe, or at least believe that he couldn't easily find out. Given Wampum's population, couldn't he plausibly have asked a friend? Or what about when he'd run into the family the night before? Who's to say he didn't find out then? The officers insisted that too many things would have had to come together to place Adam at the crime scene. Even if Adam knew Kenzie's address, they said he would have had to also know what time Chris left for work and the kids went to school so that the house would be empty. And he would have had to know the door would be unlocked. And he would have had to know where the 20-gauge shotgun was, which the police were convinced was the weapon that was used in the murder. With the tree trimmers coming at 9, police argued that there was such a narrow window for the crime to occur that it was highly unlikely Adam could have completed this task. Yeah, because it was so much more likely that an 11-year-old could have taken the opportunity to shoot his mom before going to school. The Pennsylvania State Police weren't the only ones who were dead set on labeling Jordan as the killer. Although many friends and family were adamant that Jordan was nothing but a sweet and innocent boy, Kenzie's own parents had a different opinion of him. Kenzie's father, Jack, said he'd seen a darker side of his daughter's stepkid. He was a troubled child who struggled to fit in and was capable of dark things. And his wife, Debbie, agreed. In an interview, she once said, "Jordan's a murderer and I'll say it, and his father needs to get in the mirror every morning and look in that mirror and say, I'm the father of a murderer." They just lost their daughter, and loss affects everyone differently, so maybe it was the grief that was driving their belief. Or maybe they were onto something? A majority of the world seemed to agree. As the case continued, Jordan was painted as a complete delinquent by the media. Jordan's mugshot, a little 5th grader with puppy eyes from crying all night, began circulating in the media, and his case gained a lot of attention. Everyone wanted to know if it was true, if a little kid had really murdered his stepmom. They started calling Jordan America's littlest monster. Jordan's defense attorneys believe this moniker only fueled the idea that he was guilty in the eyes of the public. In reality, it seemed like Jordan was just trying to survive. Those who knew him said he was just a normal kid. He lived an all-American childhood, playing baseball, and a member of his school's football team where Chris was one of the coaches. The father and son were very close. Jordan's mom was out of the picture early on, so Chris had been the one to raise Jordan as a single father and knew his son was innocent. Jordan's defense team worked hard to protect him, filing that he be moved to a juvenile facility and be tried as a juvenile and not an adult. Eventually, Jordan was transferred to a juvenile facility, Edmund L. Thomas Adolescent Center in Erie County, Pennsylvania. He would be held there for 3 years as he awaited trial, and Chris made sure to never leave his son's side. The distance between the Browns' house and the facility he was being held in was a 4-hour drive round trip, almost 230 miles. But Chris traveled back and forth dutifully every day. Even when it cost him time and money and even his job, the father never let his son down. According to Pennsylvania law, defendants who are under the age of 15 and are being tried as adults can be sentenced to life in prison with parole after 25 years. The defense filed to have the case decertified from an adult trial to a juvenile court. The judge at the time, Judge Dominic Motto, originally denied the request, saying that because Jordan wouldn't admit his involvement in the crime, he'd shown no remorse. But that doesn't make any sense, really, because if Jordan thought he was innocent, of course he wouldn't admit involvement. A human rights organization called Amnesty International heard about Jordan's case and argued that trying him as an adult and possibly subjecting him to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole would be a violation of international law. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court then ruled that Judge Motto's ruling violated the Fifth Amendment. So Judge Motto stepped down from the case, and it was transferred to Judge John W. Hodge, who granted Jordan's request. Jordan would be tried as a juvenile. Judge Hodge ordered that the hearing would not be open to the public and that in the interim, Jordan would continue to be held in custody until the trial. In the meantime, Jordan continued to go to school in the detention facility. In his free time, he liked reading fantasy books, likely because it was an escape from the nightmare he was living. He would sit with a book and dictionary looking up the words he didn't know. He learned to play the guitar and basketball, and his dad continued to visit him regularly. Jordan later would say the constant visits from his dad really helped him have hope and keep him from turning to anger and bitterness. In April of 2012, Jordan stood before Judge Hodge as a 15-year-old boy. Surprisingly, the original piece of evidence that police thought proved Jordan guilty, the statement from Janessa, was never presented during the trial. She never testified. The officers gave the same narrative. Jordan was a jealous little boy who chose to act out in senseless violence. The morning of February 20th, 2009, just before leaving for school with his sister, Jordan saw an opportunity to exact his revenge. He went upstairs, got the shotgun hanging on the wall of his room, saw his stepmother was asleep in bed, shot her in the back of the head, went back upstairs, put the gun back, then headed to school like nothing happened. But what about the blowback from the shotgun blast, critics wondered. Why didn't Jordan have any blood on his clothes? A forensic specialist testified that based on the position of Kenzie's head when she was shot, most of her bodily matter, if not all, could have been caught by her hair. I'm sorry, but even saying that out loud now seems like an outrageous assumption. The officers seemed so ready to believe that a little kid could craft the perfect murder, leaving behind no evidence and no mess. I'm sorry, but do you know little boys? They make messes doing the simplest tasks like making themselves a sandwich. But the judge was swayed. Judge Hodge ruled Jordan to be delinquent in the murder of Kenzie Houk. This is the juvenile court equivalent of a guilty verdict. On April 13th, 2012, Jordan was charged with first-degree murder and criminal homicide of an unborn child. Despite the less than hoped-for result, Jordan's defense team refused to let the fight end there. They planned to appeal the verdict in 2 months' time and had a whole slew of reasons why the case was mishandled. For one, the prosecutors failed to ever prove that it was Jordan's shotgun that was used as the weapon in the first place. And again, the police hadn't ever swabbed Jordan's hands for gun residue. What's more, it turns out that no fingerprints were taken at the crime scene at all. The police argued that by the time they realized they were dealing with a homicide, the integrity of the scene had already been compromised, since numerous people had been in and out of the room at that point. But still, no fingerprints whatsoever? It seemed like a serious oversight, and one that might have helped them catch the actual killer, or at least find more concrete evidence to back up the prosecutor's claims. Plus, the officer who first claimed that it had smelled like Jordan's gun had recently been fired, it turns out was revealed to have no expertise in the matter at all. Jordan's attorneys demanded hard evidence that linked Jordan to the murder. In court, the prosecutor was only able to provide plausible narratives and theories about what Jordan could have done. There were so many ways the police mishandled the investigation. They failed to record the initial interviews they conducted with Jordan and Janessa, which was a policy their department had. The first interviews are often the most important ones to document since they're the closest to when the incident actually occurred. They did, however, remember to record Janessa's later interviews where investigators could have easily influenced her narrative, whether that be intentional or not. The list goes on and on. There were so many holes in the prosecutor's theory, and a lot of the public agreed. A petition was created protesting that Jordan's Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights were violated. It was signed by nearly 4,000 people. On May 8, 2013, the Pennsylvania Superior Court sent the case back to juvenile court, agreeing that the case had been mishandled and needed to be re-looked at. Another 5 years passed before Jordan's appeal was finally heard by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, his lawyers still fighting to have his conviction overturned. Before that even happened, Jordan was released on parole on June 13, 2016. He was 18 years old and had spent 7 years in prison. He was to remain on juvenile court probation until he turned 21. The day finally came. On July 18, 2018, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court announced that Jordan's conviction was overturned in a unanimous 5-0 decision. Jordan was a free man. Since the prosecutor couldn't provide any DNA or fingerprint evidence, the Supreme Court stated that there was insufficient evidence to convict him of Kenzie's murder. They also said that there wasn't enough evidence to suggest that Jordan's shotgun was even the weapon used. In a report, the court wrote that there was enough evidence and testimony to suggest two possibilities. First, a person or persons unknown entered the house in which the victim was sleeping and shot her to death after Brown and his sister had left for school. Second, that after Brown's father left for work, Brown, in full view of his stepsister, walked upstairs and retrieved a 20-gauge shotgun from his bedroom, walked back downstairs, retrieved a shotgun shell from a box of shells located in an armoire in the victim's bedroom on which the television set she was watching was located, shot the victim in the back of the head as she lay on the bed facing the television, took the shotgun back upstairs and returned it to its former position after wiping it clean of any physical evidence caused by the shooting, then caught the school bus with his stepsister and went to school as if it were any other normal morning. A new testimony even came to light from the youngest daughter, Adeline. When the initial investigation was happening, she was so young she didn't even really understand what was going on. But now that she was older, by this time she was 13, she claimed to have remembered more things about that day. That morning she was asleep when her older siblings left for school, but was woken up when she heard a gunshot. Then she went downstairs and heard her mom's phone ringing. She answered it, and the person on the other end asked to speak with Kenzie. Seeing her mom in bed and assuming she was just asleep, Adeline went to wake her. When she turned her mother over, she saw all the blood. Immediately after that, she said that she rushed out of the house and talked to the tree trimmer. If her account was true, that would mean Jordan had already left for school and couldn't have been there when the murder happened. However, when Adeline's statement was presented to the court, it was ruled as invalid. The court said that it wasn't a reliable narrative given Adeline's age and how much time had passed since the event. Still, the Supreme Court reversed the conviction based on insufficient evidence. Although this decision didn't declare that Jordan was innocent of the charges, it did mean he could not be retried. The Brown family were overjoyed, and although Jordan had missed out on a lot of his childhood, he was determined to not let that affect his future. He was almost 21 and had already started looking ahead, enrolling into college as a computer science major. Even so, there are many that think of Jordan's release day not as a celebration, but as a failure of the justice system. To this day, the officers of the case and Kenzie's family believe Jordan to be guilty, but Jordan's lawyers urged law enforcement to continue the investigation. "There's another person that we believe is responsible," said one of the attorneys. "That person was never arrested." After all those years, when Jordan was finally released, he said this: "It used to bother me all the time. I used to hate it. But then I got to the point where it didn't bother me at all. I didn't care. But now I'm kind of like, I go back and forth sometimes, I think. I can't imagine what it must have been like to spend your adolescent years in a prison, grappling with a murder conviction and the whole world thinking you were a vicious killer." I have to say kudos to Jordan for not harboring resentment. In 2020, he and his father filed a lawsuit against the officers of the case, seeking damages for what he called a stolen childhood. Jordan had also stated in multiple interviews that he suffers from PTSD. He claimed that his 4th and 14th Amendment rights had been violated, calling what the officers did malicious prosecution and fabrication of evidence. The lawsuit also alleges that the statement Janessa gave was coerced and fabricated. She'd been interviewed 4 times the day of the murder. In her first and second statements, she never mentioned Jordan as a potential suspect, and neither of those statements were ever recorded. But by the time she gave her 3rd and 4th statements, the ones that caused Jordan to be arrested, the officers could have fed her certain information to encourage her to say Jordan was guilty. Whether or not you agree or disagree with Jordan's overturned conviction, one thing is for sure: Kenzie's murder affected people on both sides. Despite having very different views of what justice meant, both sides wanted closure for what had been done to Kenzie and her unborn child. And I will say, even if you think Jordan was responsible for the murder, I agree with the Supreme Court on the decision. I think the police failed to provide enough evidence that Jordan was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It could be that Jordan walked away having gotten away with murder, or that a killer roamed free, never facing the consequences of their actions. But what do you think? Was Jordan actually guilty? Were there stones unturned by the police? Did the justice system fail Jordan? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks again for watching. I'm Lucy, and we'll see you next time on another episode of Killer Bites.
The toy box was a windowless container that David had converted into a torture chamber. He would find young women or girls, bring them to the toy box, hold them hostage for days, and then drug them. Today, I'm going to tell you all about David Parker Ray, also known as the Toy Box Killer. Our story begins on November 6, 1939 in Belen, New Mexico, when David Parker Ray was born. His parents were mainly out of the picture due to financial reasons, so David and his younger sister Peggy lived with their grandfather. Their grandfather was a fundamentalist disciplinarian, showing little affection. Although they lived with their grandfather, David would see his violent alcoholic father Cecil often enough, and Cecil would supply David with nude magazines. What really made it bad was that these magazines were sadomasochistic, depicting sexual gratification from the infliction of physical pain or humiliation. And David was fascinated with this. David was a shy and socially awkward kid, scared of girls and bullied by kids at his school, so he was often alone. Throughout his teenage years, David's obsession of bondage and other explicit and aggressive acts just grew stronger. With all of his alone time, he would draw pictures of his fantasies. At 13, David's sister discovered these sadomasochistic drawings, as well as the nude nude photographs of violent bondage acts. His secret obsession was no longer a secret, and if he had felt any shame, that shame didn't deter him because his fantasies of these violent acts with women continued on. After high school, David became a mechanic and then joined the Army, being honorably discharged in the end. By the time David was 27, he had been married and divorced twice. His first marriage resulted in one child, a son, also named David. It was at 27 when he met his third wife, 18-year-old Glenda Burdine. She was already a mother of one before they met, and together they had a daughter named Glenda Jean Ray. Within 3 years of being married, David grew bored and left his family behind. At 30, David gave in to the free love movement and began hitchhiking across New Mexico. It was 1969, and the hippie revolution was in full swing. It's hard to say exactly when David started committing crimes, but a couple that owned a truck stop that David was staying at during those hitchhiking days recounted David arriving with his girlfriend Sally. Sally confided in the couple that David was her first relationship and that she was pregnant. A few days later, Sally went missing. That couple had no reason to not trust David, so when they asked him where she was and he said she was a free spirit and took off, well, they believed him. Pretty soon after Sally's disappearance, David grew tired of his hippie nomadic lifestyle and went back to Glenda and their daughter to try and patch things up. They were together for about 10 years before splitting for good. Those 10 years saw David behaving like the archetypal father figure when in reality, behind closed doors, his obsession with sadomasochism advanced. When the marriage between David and Glenda was over, David picked up once more. He married his fourth wife, Joni Lee, and they settled in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. The house in Elephant Butte was on Bass Road, close to the reservoir that brings thousands of tourists each year. And David was doing quite well as a mechanic and would travel regularly for work. His marriage track record wasn't particularly strong, and unsurprisingly, this fourth marriage ended as quickly as it had begun. For someone who was shy and scared of girls in high school, 4 marriages seems like quite the accomplishment. The 1980s were spent going deeper and deeper into the bondage scene. David had an insatiable thirst for violence that came with this type of pleasure. It is also during this time that David started kidnapping women. He had purchased a shipping container, and he would bring these women to the shipping container, which he had turned into the toy box. The toy box was a windowless container that David had converted into a torture chamber. He would find young women or girls, bring them to the toy box, hold them hostage for days, and then drug them. With no bodies ever found, there's no way to pinpoint the exact number of women that were brought there that never returned home. David had accomplices. He somehow found women, mainly girlfriends of his, that wanted to be a part of helping him kidnap these women. After his marriage to Joni Lee ended, David began dating Cindy Hendy. Cindy was the most notable girlfriend of his to be his accomplice. In March of 1996, David and Cindy were driving around in their RV when they came across a woman who was working the streets. Cynthia Jaramillo had rules in place to stay as safe as possible in an otherwise unpredictable job. One of those rules was not to get into an RV. But for some reason that night, she threw some caution to the wind and got in the RV with David. When they got to the back of the RV, David pulled out a badge that said he was FBI. Cynthia knew that wasn't right, so she bolted for the door, and as her hand was on it, David yelled for Cindy. This threw Cynthia off because she hadn't given him a real name, but that's when Cindy Hendy appeared from behind a curtain and shocked Cynthia with a cattle prod. Now handcuffed, Cynthia knew that the only way to get out was to try and get free and wait for the RV to slow down enough so she could jump out. She was able to unscrew the cabinet she was handcuffed to and got to her feet, still crouching down.
As they were driving off, I was able to get the handcuffs off of the cabinet door. I was waiting for them to slow down enough so I could jump out through the window or try to break out the door, but that did not happen. She came to the middle part of the seat and grabbed me right away, and I had my hands behind my back. They had a gun, and they took all my clothes off.
That was the last thing Cynthia remembers before coming to in the toy box. The FBI says that David recorded an audio tape in 1993 that he played to each of his victims. Cynthia woke up to the sound of his voice.
Yeah, it was an audio recording, and it started off his voice calling me, saying hello, and that I was picked because of my size, my body shape.
Undoubtedly, someone's going to be looking for you. They don't have any idea where you're at. You don't even know where you're at. We're always very careful about that. There are not going to be any knights in shining armor coming to rescue you. You are strictly on your own, and under the circumstances, I bet that is a scary thought.
Cynthia knew that the only way she would walk out alive was if she escaped, and after 3 days of torture, she finally got her chance. Cindy had gotten a phone call about a possible business deal. Whether it was excitement or carelessness, she left Cynthia alone, and she left her keys in plain sight.
I was able to get the keys and by pulling the table to me with my feet. And I reached through the bars and got the keys and I pushed the table back with my foot. I curled up in a ball where the lock was at against the wall and I was trying every key and it just seemed like nothing was opening it.
She was on the second key when Cindy came back into the room, seeing Cynthia in the middle of trying to break free.
And she came in and she seen I had the keys. At that point, I don't know where this ice pick came from, if she had it, if she stabbed me first or what. But I know I got beat with a lamp, I had been stabbed, and the phone ended up on the bed with me. But the lock came loose and I got it unlocked.
Cynthia bolted out the door. Naked and covered in blood, it was the first time she had been outside in days. She just chose a direction and started to run.
As I was running up the road, I did not know where I was at. I did not know what direction I was going. I didn't know where to go. I was just looking for somewhere that looked like somebody was there. And I ran right into this trailer, and the lady was doing dishes. And I busted in her door, and I grabbed her from behind and asked her to help me. And I had no clothes on. And she goes, "Are you okay?" And she grabbed the phone and dialed 911, and I remember she sat me down on this white stool, and I was bloody and naked.
They were able to react calmly, put a robe on Cynthia, and call 911. Ray and Hendy were caught. In exchange for a plea deal, Cindy turned on David almost immediately. She confessed to investigators that David Parker Ray had told her about 14 murders that he had committed and where some of the bodies had been dumped. She spoke of the different ways that he would torture his victims, truly horrific acts, and sometimes would have his friends come over to take part. Cindy gave up the names of other accomplices, which included David's daughter, Glenda Jessie Ray, his daughter. According to Cindy, Jessie and her friend, Dennis Roy Yancey, had participated in the murder of Dennis's former girlfriend, 22-year-old Marie Parker. As the investigation continued, evidence of more victims emerged. Angelica Montano came forward, telling the authorities about how she was abducted by Ray a little over a month before Cynthia Jaramillo. She had reported her kidnapping, but for some reason the police didn't investigate it. While investigating, police found photos and video of another victim in the trailer. The victim in the video turned out to be Kelly Garrett. Police were able to track down Kelly in Colorado, and she testified that she had gotten into a fight with her husband and decided to go out and play pool with friends. On July 24th, 1996, Jessie Ray, who just happened to be friends with Kelly, took her to the Blue Water Saloon in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. When Kelly had made it to the parking lot of the bar, Jessie hit her from behind, knocking her unconscious. David took her to his trailer and attached a dog collar and leash to her. She awoke, but over the course of the next 2 days, she blacked out multiple times. When David noticed she was still breathing, despite the torture, he went a step further and slashed her throat open. Thinking she was dead, he dumped her on the side of the road. Miraculously, she came to, but couldn't remember what had happened. She was treated for her injuries, but neither her husband nor police believed her story of awakening in the middle of nowhere with no recollection of what had happened after she'd left the bar. Her husband believed she had been cheating on him the night she was attacked and promptly filed for divorce. And that's when Kelly relocated to Colorado. Despite Cindy's testimony and the stories the survivors told, the FBI was unable to prove that David Parker Ray had killed anyone. He was only tried in the cases of the survivors. 3 separate trials, one for Cynthia Jaramillo, one for Angelica Montano, and one for Kelly Garrett. The trial for Cynthia Jaramillo led to a mistrial, followed by a retrial and conviction on all 12 counts for which he was accused. The trial for Angelica Montano was never brought forward as Angelica died of a drug overdose, taking her testimony to the grave. Finally, in the case of Kelly Garrett, David agreed to a plea bargain under the terms that he would be sentenced to 224 years in prison in exchange for his daughter Jessie receiving a reduced sentence. Cindy Hendy was tried as an accomplice and received a sentence of 36 years. After serving 18 of those years, Cindy was eligible for parole. Glenda Jessie Ray was tried on charges of kidnapping and received a 2.5-year prison sentence and an additional 5 years to be served on probation. Finally, Dennis Roy Yancey was convicted with the strangulation and murder of Marie Parker. He received 2 15-year sentences and was released in 2010 after only serving 11 years. But after 3 months of being out, he violated his parole, resulting in his return to custody. David Parker Ray never got to serve his sentence. On May 28, 2002, just as he was about to be transferred to prison, he suffered a heart attack and died. died at the age of 62. In November of 2002, the toy box was opened to the public with the hope that it would lead to more surviving victims coming forward. In October of 2011, the FBI performed a search of McRae Canyon near Elephant Butte Lake, looking for more potential victims, but found none. And that is the story of the toy box killer. Although there was some closure with his arrest and trial, having him pass away before serving any type of sentence sounds like justice was not served. Also, it should be said, believe women when they're coming forward, especially when it's any type of story of abuse. What are your thoughts? How did he get away with these crimes for so long? And do you find it shocking that his daughter participated in these crimes? I mean, for me, that just feels bone-chilling. Let me know in the comments below, and have a great rest of your day. I'm Jason, and thanks again for watching Killer Bites.